But just what happens? Because you can't just bring that back by growing rows of trees like an orchard, a squirrel orchard.
So Shannyn, just a little additional background. As we said, the Tongass never had a lot of the big trees. The productivity of the Tongass forest compared to areas in Oregon and Washington or southern British Columbia is lower. And the lands that were logged at first, both by the industry and then the native corporations when they got their lands, were the very best. Prince of Wales Island, which is the biggest island in Southeast and on the Tongass, was the most biologically productive area of the Tongass. And the conservation network on Prince of Wales Island now, we believe, is at risk because of over 2,000 miles of logging roads and the clear cuts and the second growth is now coming in. So, as Eric said, we don't object to Sealaska fulfilling their land entitlement, but it's where and how they do it that matters. And there are places that still have very high fish and wildlife values, and we need to be very cautious of not going into those last places and logging them. And your question about waiting for 200 or 300 years, generally, if you log old growth, you wait for 100 years or a little bit longer, and then you can log second growth. It takes about 100 years. But second growth trees, which are going to be about that big, are much different in value than old growth trees. Whether there's a real market, an economic market for second growth from Southeast with the economics of transportation and so on, kind of remains to be seen. But once you log old growth, it's very productive. The second growth that comes in very densely. There's little sunlight that gets into the forest floor. Right. So these stands are very homogeneous. They're relatively sterile habitat. They're not good places for deer. Often the stream sides get eroded and the salmon qualities values may go down. So the impacts of logging have been significant. They've been very significant on Prince of Wales. The conservation areas on the Tongass, the wilderness areas and so on, by and large, were in the rock and ice places. They have lower quality. So what we do on Prince of Wales today really, really matters. And that's why we're so concerned, not about Sealaska fulfilling their entitlements from the areas they've already selected, but going out and getting those last very best places.
I find it remarkable that this is a native corporation. They can walk in those forests and realize that their ancestors and the people who came before them didn't chop that all down, and that to actually have to explain less footprint to them. And I know Al Kukesh would be here, except he's out beating up a village right now or something. But sorry, I only say that because he's had an ethics complaint filed against him and was found ethically challenged because he's shaken people down in a village situation, in a town situation, who's trying to make these decisions for themselves. And it's very, it is tearing people apart. I've had so many people write me, email me and say, I would love to talk about this, but I'm afraid someone will recognize my voice. I mean, it's tearing people up right now. So how is this all going to play out? Are they just going to, with Mark and Lisa both in the Senate working on this bill? I don't know how it's going to be stopped. What is it going to take?
It's gotten pretty controversial, so I think it's going to be difficult to move it as legislation by itself. I think the Obama administration is pretty concerned about it, and if they had a chance to veto it as a standalone thing, I think the odds are pretty good that they would veto it. It gets more complicated if this proposal gets rolled into a Christmas tree bill that has lots of other public lands things in it.
The bundling.
Right, and if they can kind of package it with some other stuff.
Works great on mortgages.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so kind of like a subprime mortgage. Good analogy.
Well, I mean, that's basically what happens with the laws.
Yeah.
You end up getting crap in there when you're bundling it, just like with the mortgages. And we all know what happens. Everybody loses.
Yeah, and they have to hide it among some much better stuff that's good enough that everybody will want to pass the good
There's
stuff.
no bailout to fix this. right? I mean, if this goes through, and I've flown over Southeast, I've gone through on a boat and seen the clear cutting. It doesn't look like they were really working hard to fix it after they're gone. Like,
well, they let it regrow naturally, but one of the problems you get is you get erosion from the logging roads. The culverts where streams go through may not get maintained, or you get erosion around the culverts so that fish can't pass through them. There are intense impacts from the logging that's been done, especially much earlier. If folks have a chance, you might want to look for, on the internet, YouTube, for a video called Hoonah's Legacy, which will give you a sense of what it looks like after the clear cutting has been done. And it really is shocking to look at, to see how extensive it is.
It is shocking. It's like looking at an open pit mine or something. It's just like...
It is mining, really. You're mining something that won't come back in any human lifetime, like you were saying. It's hundreds of years before it returns.
May I just interject that the trees do grow back. We have heavy rainfall, there's natural regeneration, so the trees come back very, very rapidly, which is part of a problem because the habitat becomes relatively sterile for a lot of species. So it's just important to understand that once the clear cuts are done, then the new growth comes in relatively rapidly, and the conifers, the young conifers, grow over in about 25 to 30 years. And from that point until maybe 150 to 250 years, the forest is sterile.
Right, because no light gets
That's right. So that's the issue. Not that there won't be trees, but that you change the habitat. And if you cut on a 100-year cycle, then the very high-value old-growth qualities are essentially non-renewable. So that's what the issue is. Not that the trees will be gone, because the trees come back, but the characteristics of the forest will change dramatically and perhaps permanently if it's put on that rotation of cutting every 100 years.
Well, and it's just dreamy there. It really is really beautiful and remarkable for people to come through and all the other industries that are part of that, the kayaking, the hiking, the eco tours, all of this sort of thing that are going to be potentially affected by this. I know
up to 1 million passengers a year come on cruise ships through Southeast Alaska, and it's marketed as the Inside Passage, but it's essentially the Tongass National Forest that they're coming through, and they've done a reasonable job in keeping the clear cuts away from the areas that the heavy, cruise ship traffic will see.
Fundamentally, the problem is that what happened early on was logging at a wholly unsustainable rate, and there was a huge hit on the forest. It's possible to envision a sustainable logging future, but at a much reduced scale from what some of the high points in the past have been. In fact, John and I were just looking at some numbers that we were looking at an analysis of those low conflict areas that we were talking about, and when you work through the numbers, there's probably enough timber there to sustain at least for another 10 years at a level that's comparable to what's been going on in the past decade, a forest products industry. And hopefully, the goal is to manage a transition away from old growth harvest to second growth harvest.
I think they should just do hemp. I do. I think we should tax the hell out of it. Start growing pot. Why not? We got to take a break. We'll be back with questions for our panel in just a couple moments. Welcome back. This is my favorite part of the show, except for all my other favorite parts, but this is my favorite part right now, which is questions for our panel. And this used to be Ask a Girl from Homer, but come on, I need a lifeline here and a phone a friend. So from our group here, and you're welcome to come down Thursday nights here to Bernie's Bungalow and join us and be part of this live audience. Question 1, See Alaska has been given 80% of the land due them from the Native Claims Act of 1971. Has it been responsibly managed? Is the use of the land in line with the Native philosophy of making decisions with the best interest of the 7th generation? No, and no. I don't think that has. I don't consider myself like bashing anybody to say no. It's been
well. Even See Alaska would admit they're not proud of their past practices, and they say that they don't intend to log the new selections as intensively as they did previously. But one wonders why they're getting this conversion so late in the process.
Right. Well, the only thing they could do to actually log it more would have been to rip up the stumps.
They didn't clear cut it all. In fairness to them, they didn't clear cut at all. They did some more selective logging, but it's certainly not the kind of lower intensity logging that we've been talking about.
Folks in towns like Hoonah have expressed regret for clear cutting for one-time profit. Are you using, I think, using generational shifts in perspective of logging? Because there's a generation now that's seen what the logging is that probably didn't see it then, what was going to happen.
Well, yeah, clearly the proposals that have been put forward are very controversial throughout the region, so there's certainly a huge awareness. I think if you were to put this out there 50 or 100 years ago, it would have received a much different reception. So yes, there's an increasing awareness. Well,